Hey everybody, and welcome to this, my first of two videos on the Olympus OM-1. This is a fantastic camera that I've really been waiting a long time to do a review on. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to show you the three varieties that this camera came in. This one's missing a self-timer dial. You can ignore that part of it. But the one that, if you have this, you most likely have is the one with the MD badge right here that has also a little circular port right here next to the battery cover. This is a motor drive connection port, and this was the most plentiful version of them. We'll talk about how the years they were made in a minute. This is the next most plentiful version, also missing a self-timer thing. Anyway, no MD badge right here. Still an OM-1, and no motor drive connection. This model was made for 1 year. There's also this version, the original M1, which there are about 5,000 copies. And this has no motor drive connection. It actually has a self-timer. That's a step in the right direction, but also no motor drive port on the bottom. Since this is the most complete one that I have, this is the one we're going to do the video with. So regardless of which version you have, they're all fundamentally the same, with the difference of the motor drive having a motor drive connection. That's the only physical difference between them, and this doesn't really play into anything we're going to do in this video. So here it is, the Olympus OM-1. This is a 35mm interchangeable lens camera, which means that the lenses can come off and be swapped out at any point, and that it uses 35mm film. You'll see all of this in great detail throughout these two videos. It has an averaging light meter, meaning that if this is the scene that you're seeing through your camera wants to turn everything here gray, so it's going to take data from all over the scene, apply it evenly, and give you a meter reading that will come as close to gray as possible. Those were really reliable and still are a very reliable form of metering in general, because most scenes aren't all white or all black. They have a mix of tones, and an averaging meter does a pretty good job of having a good exposure from that variety of tones. This camera has shutter speeds of bulb, which is where the shutter stays open as long as you hold the shutter button down, and 1 second up to 1/1000th of a second. Through the viewfinder, the magnification is 0.92x, meaning that what you see in the viewfinder is 92% of the size of what will be on the film. And it has 97% frame coverage, meaning that 97% of what's on the film will be visible in the viewfinder. So to put that in perspective, this has one of the best viewfinders of any camera ever made. Let's just get that out of the way. It is amazing to look through. And 97% would mean that over the entire frame, top, bottom, and sides, you're losing about 0.75% roughly on each of the perimeters. That's a very difficult engineering task, and today there are only a handful of cameras that even come close to that. And we have computers and things like that that are very advanced to tell us how to make them well. So in this camera's time, it was an amazing feat. The focusing screens on this camera, which are right here, are interchangeable. This has a plain matte screen, but there are 14 different focusing screens you can get for the Olympus OM-1. And the flash sync on this camera, whether you use the hot shoe or the PC port over here for X flash sync, which is what the modern flash syncs are, is 1/60th of a second. So let's talk about the model history for this camera. This was targeted at professionals. Arguable whether or not there were a ton of professionals who adopted it, because they didn't have things like interchangeable prisms that a lot of professionals demanded. But it was certainly picked up by advanced professionals and really talented hobbyists. And there were professionals who used these because they're very small and light cameras, meaning that they're very easy to carry around. The amazing viewfinder on these is the primary clue telling you that this is a professional grade camera. Because it's got such a nice viewfinder, that's something that would be incredibly important to a professional who's going to be looking through this camera a significant chunk of the day, every day. And as I mentioned, even many top-end DSLRs today don't have a viewfinder as nice as this one. It also accepts almost every part of the entire OM system. There's one part it won't accept, and that's the focusing screen 2.4, which was designed for the OM4, OM3, and the 2S program. I think it'll also work in the 2N. Anyway, if you take the 2.4 focusing screen and file down the tab a little bit so it fits in here, this camera will not meter properly with it. So that's the only part of the entire M system that this camera, at least that the motor drive versions of this camera, cannot use. So this camera was made by Olympus in Japan. The M1, this one right here, was made only in 1972. The OM1 here that does not have the motor drive connection, this was made only in 1973. And this OM1 right here that has the motor drive connection, and this is the one that can accept everything except that one focusing screen in the entire system, was made sometime from 1974 until 1979. The OM-1N replaced this camera, and that was made until 1987 from 1979 onward. These were preceded by nothing directly. They were the first professional SLR from Olympus. Olympus had made rangefinders and things like that beforehand, but nothing at all like this. And these were followed by the OM-1N in 1979. They were concurrent with almost every OM camera that Olympus made because the run of these from 79 to 87 aligns with almost the entire production run of the Olympus OM system. And it was followed, in addition to the OM-1N, by the OM2, though the two cameras were made concurrently at the same time for a long time. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through the camera from top to bottom as we do. We're going to start here, technically on the sides, with the strap lugs. That's these little guys right here that allow you to hold a camera strap or fit a camera strap to it. Right here is the film rewind knob and lever assembly. This is what you will use to rewind your film. This is your meter mode on-off switch. All this controls is the meter, whether the meter is running or whether the meter is not. This has no control whatsoever over the shutter action. So you can use the camera perfectly with a dead battery or with this in off if you know how to meter scenes well. Here is the hot shoe. The hot shoes are detachable, but I'm not gonna, I guess I'll take it off. The hot shoes are detachable on all of the OMs except for the S2 program, the 3 and the 4. So the OM1 and most of the OM2s have detachable hot shoes, and you could put different types of hot shoes in that could do different things. But for the OM1s, this is pretty much the hot shoe, is this really basic one that I'm screwing in the wrong way. There we go. Oh, while we have the hot shoe off, you can see here the port. The OM2s and the OM1Ns had different types of ports as well. So you can tell on the top of your camera what type of shoes it will accept by looking at what type of port is there. We'll screw this guy back on. It's a weird backwards screwing deal. There we go. This is the ISO, or as it was called back in the day, ASA, dial that you use to set the film's sensitivity. This little silver button right here is the unlock. You push this and then you can adjust what sensitivity you're using. Shutter button. That little black line next to the shutter button indicates which ISO you're set to. This is the film advance lever that you would use to advance your film. And then the frame count window that shows you which frame you're on. On the front of the camera, we have over here the film rewind dial. This is what you adjust to rewind your film. There's no button on the bottom of the camera, as is the case with most cameras. This is the mirror lockup dial. There we go. This is what you use to lock the camera's mirror upward. Self-timer right here. That's just going to count down. This is the lens mount. This dial right here is what controls the shutter speed. This is your flash PC port right there, and it has FP and X, and you use this little thing next to it to adjust that. Just use X. Just set it to X and forget it, because FP bulbs, they're made, but they're expensive. The flashes are hard to find. Any flash you're going to buy online that's new or at any store is going to be an X type flash. So just leave it there and you'll be okay for using a flash. If you set it to FP and use an X flash, the timing of the triggering for your flash is going to be off and it's not going to work properly. On the camera's back, very complex here, we have the viewfinder window. On the camera's bottom, we have the battery cap. As we saw for the MD versions, there's a motor drive connection cap right here, tripod bushing, made in Japan, and then the camera's serial number over here. Going to the inside of the camera here, inside the camera we can see here, this is the film cassette chamber. We'll see what to do with this in the second video, but this is where you put your film. Here we have two film guide pins on the top and bottom. As the film's coming out of the cassette, this helps to line it up properly. These long horizontal silver deals are film guide rails. These two inner ones sandwich the film between this and the film pressure plate that we'll see in a moment. And these two outer ones are slightly raised and they keep the film from moving up and down. Then we have two more film guide pins to help the film continue moving smoothly. The film tension sprocket right here prevents the film from moving backwards, and this won't roll backwards until you adjust the dial on the front to rewind the film, and then it spins freely. There we go. And advancing the film undoes that. This is the film take-up spool right here, and of course we have the shutter. On the back of the camera we don't have a whole lot. We have the film pressure plate, which sandwiches the film here, and then a little spring to help with film alignment, and that's really all that this camera needs. A lot of films have or a lot of cameras rather have rollers and things like that here to press up against this, but this does such a good job of aligning the film, it doesn't need that extra piece on the film back. So here's an Olympus OM-1 that has an MD connection on it, and you'll note that the guide rails in it are different than they are in the M1. There's no guide pins at the end of this, and these guide rails up on the top and bottom are significantly thicker. There was film in this camera. Oops. Here's one that's a pre-MD OM1, and you can see it still has the thinner guide rails and the guide pins at the end here. So when they made the MD version, they also simplified the internal design slightly by removing the guide pins. Either they were too expensive or they realized that they just didn't need them. Some notes on the Olympus OM-1. The shutter will work without batteries, right? So you can demonstrate that. That was 1/30th of a second. Go up to 1/1000th. If you'd like to see what it looks like with the back open to let the light through. There we go. Go back down here to 1 second. There we go. And of course, oh dang it. There we go. Bulb also works. On some of these older ones, if you change the shutter speed before you advance the film, they don't really like that. So it's a good idea to advance the film before you adjust the shutter speed dial. The M1 cameras are known for having bad prisms. So if we take a look at the top of this one right here, the prism sits right here underneath this bulge, right? And what happens is the light comes in through the opening, hits the mirror, it bounces up and around the prism and out to your eyepiece right here. And when these were assembled, the prisms sit in here and they have a metal saddle that holds them down. It basically just fits over the prism, and then there's a couple of little holes on it that allow it to be screwed into the camera chassis, one right about here and one right about here. And then on top of that, because Olympus loved foam, they had some sort of love affair with it. I don't understand because the stuff's disgusting. Or maybe they were just in bed with big foam, no one knows. Anyway, in addition to that saddle, which is all they needed to hold the prism, they also put foam on the prism. My assumption is that at the time they would put the housing down and then the foam would touch the housing and hold the prism in place very precisely. It actually didn't do anything because the saddle was enough to hold it precisely. At any rate, I've taken a few of these apart. I've never seen one where the foam still touches the metal, so maybe it did originally, maybe not. The foam has an adhesive on the back of it to hold it to the prism, and that adhesive over time has eaten away the silver on some of these. There's no repairing it. All you can do is find a good prism to swap in if yours has prism degradation. If you have an M1, which isn't going to be very many of you because there are only about 5,000 of these made, but if you have one, there were a couple of iterations at least of the M1. The differences were entirely internal. This is a very old M1. My first M1, which was stolen and worked beautifully, it was an amazing camera, was a newer M1. And the serial numbers on them are only about 2,000 apart, less than 1,500. So these older M1s had a different type of galvanometer than the newer M1s and then the OM1s. So these older galvanometers can't be replaced with a newer galvanometer. And the galvanometer is the bit that makes the light meter needle go up and down. So if the galvanometer on this fails, the only way to get one that's working is to find an older style M1 with an older galvanometer that's still working. My solution to this one's failed galvanometer after 2 rounds with my repair guy trying to get it working with no success is to just have the galvanometer and the mask for the meter dial removed. So this is going to have a completely naked focusing screen with no meter needle in it and a useless on-off switch that's going to do nothing whatsoever. That's your solution if you have one of these older M1s and the galvanometer fails, because the only other solution is to find an older M1 that's very collectible and pirate the galvanometer out of that. So that's a downside to collecting old cameras, especially when you end up with one of the oldest of the old. So let's talk about some things not to do with your camera. The first one is don't store your camera in a plastic bag or box, because that can get moisture in it and that can cause fungus to grow on the lenses or in the leather, and it's a good way to ruin a good camera. Also, don't store your camera with the shutter ready to fire. Always discharge it before you store it. That means just hit the shutter button, and now, having discharged it, this camera's ready to go. The reason you want to do that is that when you arm the shutter, you're tensioning a bunch of springs down here. So if you put this into storage, even for a few weeks or months with these springs tensioned, you risk taking the springiness out of them and causing some issues in shutter timing and shutter operation. So always store your camera with the shutter triggered. If you're going to put it away for a week and then go shoot, it's worth sacrificing 1 frame on your film if you're partway through it, just to protect your shutter mechanism. Don't touch the shutter itself. I know that it looks like a lot of fun to let this thing open, stick your finger in it, and let it close on your finger. It's not fun. It's a good way to ruin your camera. So don't do that. Also, don't touch the mirror, because the oils on your finger, this is a surface-coated mirror, meaning that the silver is on the surface of it. The oil from your finger can ruin that. So when I have to clean these, I'll take a piece of lens tissue and bunch it up like a feather, so it looks kind of like a small feather duster, and put a little bit of lens cleaning fluid on it, and then do this, take another one that's clean and dry it without putting too much pressure on that, because that helps protect the silver when it has to be cleaned, which is every once in a while. Don't leave your camera or your lenses in your car, because that's a really good way for someone to say, hey, I'm going to break that window, and for you to lose your camera. It's also a good way for the heat to damage your lenses especially, but also camera. What can happen is that the heat can make the oils in the camera and the lenses really thick. Really thin, and then they flow to places they shouldn't be. They get thick again, and then they're going to cause issues. I'll show you what that looks like. Here's a 55mm 1.2 lens, so this should show you fairly well what happens when oil gets on the aperture blades. Yep, just like that. So best case scenario when this happens is that the lens stops down properly and opens up slowly. Worst case scenario is that it does neither of those things. Don't think you can see. Yeah, I took this lens apart and got the oil pretty well cleaned off of it, so it actually kind of works now. Let's see, right there where the light is, at the edge of that aperture near the housing of the lens, you might see a little shiny dot. That's a little bit of oil that's still on the leaves. Don't do that. The other thing is, if it gets really cold in your car, the oils in your camera body will get thick and gummy, and if that happens a few times, it can break down, and then you have thick oil interfering with the proper operation of your camera. Also, don't let these cameras get wet. They're not weather sealed, and the mechanical bits in them can rust. The electronics can be ruined by getting wet as well, but really rust on these all mechanical cameras that don't have to have a battery to operate is the big threat. And just remember, your camera is a precision tool and should be cared for and handled as such. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So that's it for the first video. In the second video, we're going to look at everything on this camera and talk about how to make it work. We've talked about what it is. Next, we're going to talk about how it functions. We're going to look at the process of taking a photo and how to take a double exposure on these as well. So if this video or this video series was helpful to you, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know I'm on the right track and making content that is useful and helpful to you. If you have ideas or suggestions, please leave those below. I'm pretty good about responding to comments every day or two. And lastly, thank you guys for watching, and whatever you do with your cameras, just remember to use them, care for them, and enjoy them, and use them as a way to express the creativity that they can allow you to express.